To the point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
A very good afternoon and welcome to the Briefing PM, an hour of the latest political news, debate and analysis here on GB News. I'm Darren McCaffrey and here's what's coming up between now and 4 o'clock, with the Prime Minister and the Chancellor both now having faced paying fines over breaching COVID regulations in Number 10 in June 2020. We'll get reaction from across the political spectrum, including from a Conservative MP who's backing the Prime Minister and says he should stay in post to continue leading the country. We'll be discussing the allegations that Russian forces have used chemical weapons in Mariupol and what it means for the future of Ukraine and the Russian conflict. Could it draw us into this war? And the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has axed a planned trip by the German president, saying that he didn't want him in Kyiv due to his close ties with Russia. What is the latest on that from Berlin? Plus, there's been more flights cancelled across the country this morning as authorities warn this weekend could be chaos for millions of us trying to get away for our Easter break. Well, at the latest, with the effervescent Simon Coulter. As always, though, do get in touch with your views as well. You can email me at gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet me at gbnews. All that and so much more between now and 4 o'clock. But first, here's Rosie at the top of the hour with the news.
Good afternoon, it's just gone 3 o'clock. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date. The terrorist who murdered Sir David Amess is going to spend the rest of his life in jail, having been given a whole life order. The judge, Mr Justice Sweeney, said Ali Harbi Ali showed no remorse or shame after he killed the Conservative MP last October. Sir David's family described the murder as beyond evil. Met Police Assistant Commissioner Matt Dukes read out a statement on their behalf.
There is no elation in our family today following this sentencing. Our amazing husband and father has been taken from us in an appalling and violent manner. Nothing will ever compensate for that. We will wake each day and immediately feel our loss. We will struggle through each day for the rest of our lives. It breaks our heart to know that our husband and father would have greeted the murderer with a smile of friendship and would have been anxious to help. How sickening to think what happened next. It is beyond evil.
Well, long-time friend of Sir David, Anne Widdecombe, told GB News that families need to look out for any signs of radicalisation.
I would say to families, if you've got any suspicions, think of your relative as well. If you can't think beyond that to the victims, think of the relative. This is what's waiting for him. And that's why I'm glad he wasn't shot. He didn't get his martyrdom. This is what is waiting for them.
In some other news now, UK inflation has hit a 30-year high. That's put households under growing pressure. Official figures show it jumped to 7% in March. That's up from 6.2% in February. Higher petrol and food prices have fuelled the rise. Finance analyst at Hargreaves Lansdown, Sarah Cole, says this means a squeeze on consumer incomes and a rise on overall costs for businesses.
What's particularly noticeable about this inflation is that it's affecting the essentials, so things like energy prices and fuel prices, which means that people have less discretionary spending, so they have less to spend on things from other suppliers. So it's going to mean that for businesses they're under pressure sort of from both sides in a way.
The Prime Minister's position has been described as untenable. Nigel Mills is thought to be the first Conservative backbencher to call for Boris Johnson's resignation. Well, that's after Boris Johnson, his wife Carrie Johnson and Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, were fined by police for breaching coronavirus rules when they attended the Prime Minister's birthday party in June of 2020. They have all apologised and confirmed the fines have been paid. Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross told GBNews Boris Johnson needs to focus on the job at hand, despite calling for his resignation in January.
About the Prime Minister in January, because I thought his actions were unacceptable. Now that the fixed penalty notice has been issued and accepted and paid by the Prime Minister, I still believe that, and I share the anger and the fury that many people have about this. But I can't also ignore the situation in Ukraine, where we've heard President Zelensky single out Boris Johnson as being one of the leaders in the West that has done most to help him and his people defend their country and their freedom.
In some other news now, voters in the Chancellor's constituency of Richmond in Yorkshire gave us their reaction.
Sunak should go now. I don't suppose they will, but that's my opinion. I think they should have gone.
They've done the crime, now they're having to pay the fine.
We all have parties when we shouldn't, and because it's in the past, we have to look for the future, hopefully.
I just think it's an absolute disgrace, really.
To be honest, I mean, if there was 20,000 fined, and I've watched his explanation on the television, as there's much bigger things currently, I'm afraid, we should be getting on without destabilising the country at this time.
The Information Commissioner's Office says there isn't enough evidence to prosecute the two people suspected of leaking CCTV footage of the former Health Secretary and his aide kissing in his office. The images showed Matt Hancock embracing while social distancing rules were still in place. The leaked footage eventually led to the former Health Secretary's resignation. The ICO launched a criminal investigation after it received a report of a personal data breach, but has concluded that the evidence is insufficient to charge anyone. The UK is sanctioning 178 Russian separatists for propping up breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine. The move's been coordinated with the European Union. It's as Moscow's bombardment of Ukraine continues. In his latest address, Volodymyr Zelensky said Russia's using phosphorus bombs against his country.
I urge you, whilst approving new and extremely important package of sanctions against Russia, a total blockade of Russian banks is also necessary. Not just part of them, all of them. And I also urge you to finally sanction Russian oil.
People carrying drugs used to spike drinks will now face harsher sentences. The date rape drug, for example, GHB, along with two other related substances, have been reclassified now as Class B. Well, that means that people with drugs in their possession could be jailed for up to 5 years. Those involved in supply and production face up to 14 years behind bars. Home Secretary Priti Patel says the changes will help improve safety. This is GB News. You're up to date. I'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's head back to Darren for the briefing.
Thanks very much indeed, Rosie. It is 7 minutes past 3 o'clock on this Wednesday afternoon. You're watching us on TV, online and listening to us on DAB digital radio. Thank you very much indeed for your company. We are going to begin with a Partygate today because Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, you may have seen this, revealed that they'd paid fines for attending a lockdown-busting birthday party bash in June 2020. The Prime Minister apologised because he said he had fell short of his own COVID rules. In a rather sheepish statement from Chequers, the Prime Minister rejected demands to quit, but said, I accept in all sincerity that people have the right to expect better. The Chancellor also released his own statement, saying, I deeply regret the frustration and anger caused, and I am sorry, he said, that, like the Prime Minister, I'm focused on delivering for the British people at this challenging time. Let's go live to Downing Street, speak to our political correspondent, Tom Harwood, who is there for us. Tom, a very good afternoon to you. What is the sense of the mood inside Downing Street? We know the Prime Minister is in Chequers. We don't know where the Chancellor is. But amongst his team, is there a sense that actually they've got control of this and there's not necessarily the same panic that we saw back in January and February when these allegations were dripping out week after week.
Darren, that's exactly right. There isn't that same level of heat, of worry, of anguish, really, in terms of what is going to happen going forward. However, that's not to say that the temperature hasn't increased here, both in number 10 and in number 11, of course. It was Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who did not expect to get a single fixed penalty notice order issued to him by the Metropolitan Police. That was a big surprise for the Chancellor and potentially a big worry for him and his future political career. Obviously, his statement yesterday took a lot longer to come out than the Prime Minister's. Potentially the Prime Minister more prepared for that situation than the Chancellor. However, as you rightly indicate, there doesn't seem to be that same temperature here as there was several months ago. Yes, this is a significant moment. Yes, the Prime Minister has questions to answer. But no, do we not feel like we are getting close to the threshold of letters that need to go in to the office of Sir Graham Brady MP, the chairman of the 1922 committee? Do we feel close to that triggering point for an internal Conservative Party leadership election? Well, not quite yet. And why is that? Well, partly MPs are mostly not in Westminster at the moment. We're in the middle of the Easter parliamentary recess. Indeed, Easter bank holiday weekend begins this weekend, and MPs are not back until the middle of next week. Potentially the temperature will rise then. Potentially it will be a tricky Prime Minister's questions for the Prime Minister. But ultimately, the specific offence for which he has been fined so far is a relatively minor one in the scale of things. One that, as I say, the Chancellor did not expect to be fined for. One that many commentators, many journalists, and indeed many lawyers, some of whom I've spoken to today, are genuinely surprised that this event elicited a fixed penalty notice. It's, of course, an event that number 10 staff felt free to brief out to the press back in 2020, in June 2020, when it happened. They didn't think it was illegal, and they briefed it to the press as sort of pieces of colour for various stories that were printed that weekend. The question, however, is that if the line, if the level for which an event, if the threshold for which an event needs to reach to be fined is that sort of event, then there may well be more fines on the way. And that's the real question for this Prime Minister. What happens not today, not this weekend, potentially not even at Prime Minister's Questions this Wednesday, but in the weeks that follow?
Yeah, indeed, Tom, and as you say, we could well see more fines for the Prime Minister. We know there are allegations he attended lots more parties, and you add to that the possibility that there are pictures that may well get released, and there's Sue Gray's full report, there's local elections. At the moment of complete danger for the Prime Minister hasn't passed, even if the pressure is not like it was back at the start of the year.
That's right, and ultimately we need to remember who really matters in this calculation. In this calculation, it's an unusual political issue because this is an internal Conservative Party issue. It's not something that the statements of opposition of MPs, of the leaders of the Labour Party, the Lib Dems, the SNP, whoever else, their statements here aren't going to move the needle. What's going to move the needle is what Conservative MPs think, because ultimately they're the people who keep the Prime Minister in the building behind me. So what Conservative MPs think on this issue is absolutely crucial. And for now, the argument seems to be persuasive that there are bigger fish to fry, that the Prime Minister has been doing rather well in terms of dealing with the Ukraine-Russia situation, that in many ways the United Kingdom under his leadership has been leading the world when it comes to sanctioning Russia and supporting Ukraine. And particularly when we think about other issues, the issues that ordinary people up and down the country really care about, whether it's their heating bills, whether it is, of course, the cost of living more generally, the sky-high inflation that this country, that the Eurozone and that the United States of America is now experiencing. The question is, do Tory MPs now think that the time has come to plunge the party and indeed the country into a leadership contest. Now, in the previous situations whereby the Conservative Party has swapped leaders in the middle of various crises, whether it was the Second World War or anything else, that happened when there wasn't a contest. Neville Chamberlain was swapped for Winston Churchill pretty cleanly, pretty easily. Well, the situation of the Chancellor of the Exchequer being fined now means there is no immediate, obvious successor to Boris Johnson. There would be a protracted, potentially quite messy leadership contest. It wouldn't be a smooth replacing of the leader of the Conservative Party and indeed the Prime Minister. So potentially the situation whereby we may find ourselves in messy politics as a result of a no-confidence vote is holding Conservative MPs back from doing what they might well have done several months ago.
OK, Tom, as always, appreciate your thoughts and your analysis this afternoon. Tom Harwood, our political correspondent, joined us from Downing Street. Well, let's go from Tom Harwood to the Conservative MP, Tom Hunt, who joined us down the line. He's, of course, the MP for Ipswich. Tom, very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
My first question is, surely it must be more than embarrassing and more than simply offering an apology that the Prime Minister, as Theresa May suggested months ago, didn't seem to know what the law of the land was, the laws that he introduced.
I mean, clearly it's not a good situation at all, which is why the Prime Minister and the Chancellor both issued full public apologies yesterday, accepting full responsibility. Those who make the rules should understand them fully and should follow them. And clearly, we've had this fine, which Prime Minister will be paying, the Chancellor will be paying, and I can understand why many of my constituents are very angry about it. However, the question then leads to, what do we do next? And is it appropriate, is it responsible to look to trigger a leadership election and to remove a Prime Minister at this particular moment in time where there is a war in Europe, where there is a cost of living challenge of great proportion? My personal conclusion is that I do not think it is the time to be looking to do that. So I will not be sending in a letter of no confidence in the Prime Minister.
Tom was saying there, though, are you concerned that this might, far from being the end of all of this, might simply be the beginning, that the Prime Minister might get fined time and time again? We know he went to other events at Number 10 that the police are looking into. Are you concerned that, as I say, that this is going to rumble on even more and that the public anger potentially could increase as well?
I think a lot of people have already got angry about this. And I think that the confirmation that there's been a fine might make some more angry. But to be honest with you, I think that when I knock on doors, which wasn't yesterday, by the way, but I did have some of our team were knocking on doors yesterday. Generally speaking, the issues coming up were local issues. And when we did have national issues coming up, it was cost of living and it was Ukraine. Occasionally this comes up, and I suspect it might come up a little bit more now because of what happened yesterday. But I'm not getting the sense that on the doorstep, this is actually preoccupying the minds of the majority of my constituents every moment of the day. Many are very angry about it, and I understand that. But I think they are mostly concerned with those other issues I've just mentioned.
Is that the kind of calculation, if you could, in a sense, Tom, give us an idea of what you and other backbenchers are thinking, is that in the end, obviously what he was done was pretty bad, he's apologised for it, but more importantly, that this isn't likely to sway public opinion that much that it may well cost you, your colleagues, their seats at the next election or votes in the forthcoming local elections?
Well, I seek to represent my constituents as best as I can, and that includes trying to reflect their views as best I can. Of course, views on this, like many other issues, will be divided. Different people will have different views. But I mean, clearly, if I was, knocking on doors and every person or every other person was frothing at, incredibly angry about this and thought that now was the time to plunge into a 2 or 3 month leadership campaign at a time when there was a war in Europe, then obviously that's something I'd take into account. But that is not what I'm picking up on the doorstep at the moment. I think when I talk to people, they are concerned often about their bills. They're deeply concerned about what's happening in the Ukraine, and they want us to help the Ukrainian people as much as we can. And they're interested in things like potholes, they're interested in things like dental appointments, highways, and I think that, some people have said that this war in Ukraine, somehow it's being used as a sort of fig leaf. I mean, that's not true at all. I mean, it's the most significant development in mainland Europe potentially since the end of the Second World War. And actually, we have had a Prime Minister who I think has led from the front. I think he's galvanised the West. I think he's been singled out by President Zelensky for the allyship that he's provided Ukraine in their moment of need. And that has shifted the minds and the thinking of many members of Parliament. So, and I think it's legitimate that that's been the case. I think it's the Prime Minister has shown the Prime Minister in a very good light. At the end of the day, having a Prime Minister who can lead from the front on those sorts of international issues is of importance to many people.
Yeah, in saying that, just very finally, Tom, on this, because I know it's got some people animated, not least of all on Twitter today, this idea about the war in Ukraine and whether it should be impacting on our politics here. I mean, people have pointed out not just what happened during the Second World War, or indeed the First World War, but, Margaret Thatcher was turfed out of office during the First Gulf War. We were actually involved in the First Gulf War. We know that Anthony Eden lost his job during Suez. That was a pretty big foreign policy problem for Britain. I mean, we're not actually involved militarily in Ukraine. The French are having a presidential election at the moment where they could see a very dramatic change in whoever the French president is. And many people say that this has just been used as an excuse by some simply to defend Boris Johnson. And actually, I saw some people today suggesting it was even a bit tasteless in the sense that, the British people aren't dying in Ukraine. It's a bit unfair to kind of pick up the baton on behalf of the Ukrainians and claim that we're so important we can't look at what's happening at home.
Well, I think we all saw a Prime Minister in Kyiv at the weekend, and we saw the members of the public in Ukraine going up to him, and we heard what they said to him. We saw the way in which President Zelensky embraced the Prime Minister. We can come to our own conclusions about whether that's tasteless. We can come to our own conclusions about whether that's a fig leaf. It didn't look like that to me. Not at all. And when we look at these other examples, Neville Chamberlain was pushed out because of a failure of foreign policy. He was pushed out because of a failure of appeasement as a strategy. And when we look at the Suez Canal, he was pushed out because of, with regards to this war in Europe, the Prime Minister has widely been acknowledged to be doing a good job. So he wouldn't be being pushed out for that. He'd be pushed out for being something completely peripheral to the foreign policy issue at hand. With regards to France, well, they've got it enshrined in their constitution that they have an election at a particular time. This is their presidential election, and they're cracking on with it. We're not in that position. We're in a different position. But I think it's rare that you've got so many crucially important issues bubbling up at the same time like they are at the moment. And I think we stick with the Prime Minister. I don't really know what else there is to say about all of this issue to do with finance and parties. We know it's made a lot of people angry. We know it's not good. What else is there to say?
OK. Really appreciate that, Tom. Appreciate your thoughts and your time this afternoon. There's Tom Hunt there, MP for Ipswich. Thank you very much indeed. And happy Easter, Tom, as well. OK, you're watching GB News. We'll be back in a couple of minutes talking a bit more about this issue. Do get in touch, gbviews@gbnews.uk. Lots of you already pretty animated this hour about that story. We're also going to be turning our attention to Ukraine and indeed to potential travel chaos this bank holiday Easter weekend. That's all after we find out something that's probably more important than the travel chaos is what's the weather going to be like? And it's not looking too bad, actually.
Hello, I'm Alex Deakin with your latest weather update. Some heavy showers around today. They'll be fading through the evening and overnight, and for most, it's looking like a dry and a bright day to come tomorrow. Low pressure near to the northeast of Scotland, bringing some pretty wet and cold weather across the far northeast, but elsewhere it's been by and large fine. But we have seen some big showers developing across central and southern parts of England and southern parts of Wales. Those heavy downpours still continuing for the next few hours before steadily fading away through this evening, and most places dry from midnight onwards. The wet weather in the far northeast also starting to ease. It is going to turn murky and misty across the south in particular, and temperatures dropping down to the mid-single figures. On to Thursday, and it will by and large be a dry and a bright day, but it is going to start pretty grey across the Midlands, South Wales, southern England. It may take a while before that cloud clears away. Quite cloudy too over Northern Ireland and western Scotland. A little bit of drizzly rain is possible at times here. It could be quite wet in the Western Isles, but for the vast majority, it is going to be a dry day, and it'll probably brighten up quite a bit as well. So some places seeing some sunshine, and temperatures responding to that sunshine as well. The warmest weather across eastern England, 2021. Elsewhere, generally mid to high teens. A bit more of that patchy rain, just fringing into the highlands at times through the nights, but otherwise, again, it's generally going to be a dry night with clear spells. Again, turning a little misty in some spots, and we'll see maybe a bit of showery rain just clipping the west of Wales, southwest England as we head into Good Friday. 1 or 2 showers across northern Scotland too, but again, for most Good Friday, dry and fine. Probably a sunnier day, certainly over the Midlands, parts of eastern England and northwest Scotland. Plenty of sunshine, and temperatures again responding to that sunshine, maybe up to the low 20s across the southeast. A little cooler perhaps on some North Sea coast, and that could be a feature into Saturday as well. But for the Easter weekend, many places dry with some sunshine, turning cooler, a bit wetter by Monday.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's 2 questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you, or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Very welcome back. It is 27 minutes past 3 o'clock on this Wednesday afternoon. Thank you very much indeed for your company. Lots of you been getting in touch, perhaps unsurprisingly, about Partygate, GBViews at gbnews.uk. Lots of people saying they're outraged, other people saying, frankly, we don't care, move on. Bill says, so Boris had 9 minutes having been surprised by a birthday cake that he didn't even cut. How is that different to Starmer and his beer and pizza after a day's campaigning? There is a lot of people out there pointing out that GB News is losing its impartiality. David says, relating to Boris's birthday party only, for which he was fined, it's widely accepted that Boris was hijacked. It was a surprise. I like that word, hijacked. For the general public, the planner of an event that broke the rules was heavily fined, and that was Carrie Johnson. For this specific party, Boris should not have been fined. Boris should not resign. If he receives extra fines, that's a different matter. We know those police investigations are continuing. And Doug says, for God's sake, drop your ridiculous attention to that non-event. Well, we are going to do that, but not for another couple of minutes, because we are at the moment going to speak to Neale Hanvey. He is an Albi MP for Kilcoddy and Cowdenbeath and joins us right now. Neale, do you think we should move on? Are you bored of all of this? Do you think people don't care?
Well, I think there's a fundamental principle at stake here about trust in the person who occupies the highest office in the land. And for those of us with children who try to teach them about right and wrong and taking responsibility and being accountable for their actions, this is a pretty poor lesson from the Prime Minister, and he really has to take proper responsibility. But the way that I would like to move on, and I'd like to see Scotland move on, is by asking this question. Is this really the best group of people to govern Scotland? Is this really the best form of government for Scotland? Is it not time now for Scotland to respond to this in a democratic way, have an opportunity to take control of our country, to assert ourselves as an independent nation, and to govern ourselves away from all of the absolute mess that the Johnson government have created in Westminster?
I mean, I'm very impressed you managed to change an answer about whether people are angry about Partygate into a campaign for a second Scottish independence referendum. If we can, let's just stay on. No, it's fair enough. It's fair enough. It's what politicians do. Let's just stick with the matter at hand for a second, in the sense that people would say this isn't a resigning matter, in the sense that it is kind of akin to a speeding fine. If you got a speeding fine, you wouldn't resign as an MP. No one would do that in their daily jobs. Millions of people get fined every year. We are getting slightly carried away.
Well, we're not really, because speeding fines, lots of MPs have found themselves under enormous pressure when they've had a speeding fine. It doesn't require them to resign as an MP. Of course not. Everybody has to understand that MPs are real people and they make mistakes. But we're talking about the Prime Minister, and we're talking about someone who repeatedly assured Parliament that there was nothing to see here and that everything was above board. And none of that has proven to be true. So it's not just about the party. It's not just about the breaking of the rules. It's the repeated misleading of Parliament. And the Sue Gray report is going to land tomorrow. And we will again see the depth of concern about the Prime Minister's behaviour and how he has continuously led Parliament down the wrong conclusion that he was surprised that the parties had existed when he was at the lion's share of them. It really is a fundamental principle about integrity, honesty and responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, just to point out, I mean, I think the potential might have been up to 18 parties across Downing Street and Whitehall. I think he's certainly been, or alleged to have been, at a number of them. I'm not entirely sure it's the majority of them. But you're right in suggesting this could carry on. But ultimately, frankly, this is going to be up to Conservative MPs to decide. Not for you or I or anyone else, really, whether he remains in post until at least the next general election. And in those circumstances, they say, well, now's not the time because of those big challenges that we know are facing the country, whether you live in Cowdenbeath or whether you live in Cornwall, about the cost of living crisis, the war in Ukraine. Now is not a good time to be changing the leader of the country.
Well, I fundamentally disagree with that. Does that position rest upon the argument that because of all of these international challenges and local challenges, we should just stumble on with someone who has proven to be serially dishonest and someone who does not take responsibility for their actions? And that applies to both Rishi Sunak and to the Prime Minister himself. It's simply inconceivable that they are the best of a bad bunch. I mean, is that really what we are saying? And the points have been made repeatedly about the French election for a new president and other democratic processes taking place in the midst of international events. International events do not stop and should not stop democracy. This war is something that, of course, we are determined to see a resolution to as swiftly as possible. But really, is Boris Johnson himself key to that? The House are reasonably well united. There are some nuances in the House about how we should approach the Ukrainian situation, but there hasn't been any great division there. And so surely replacing Boris Johnson is not beyond the Conservative Party to get right, because the longer he stays in office, the more complicit his backbenchers are for his transgressions, and the more damage it will do to them as a party as we head towards the general elections.
Neale, appreciate your time this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed. Neale Hanvey there, the Alva MP, joining us from Scotland. OK, let's bring you up to date with the news now. It's just after 3:30.
Good afternoon. Let's get you up to date. The terrorist who murdered Sir David Amess will spend the rest of his life in jail after being given a whole life order. The judge, Mr Justice Sweeney, said Ali Harbi Ali showed no remorse or shame after he killed the Conservative MP last October. UK inflation has hit a 30-year high, putting households under more pressure. Official figures show inflation jumped to 7% in March. That's up from 6.2% in February. Increasing prices of petrol and food are fuelling the rise. Another increase in inflation is expected in April, reflecting the recent hike in energy bills. The Prime Minister's position's been described as untenable by a Conservative backbencher. It's Nigel Mills who's calling for Boris Johnson's resignation. It's after the Prime Minister, his wife and the Chancellor were fined by police for breaching COVID rules when they attended the Prime Minister's birthday party in June 2020. They've all apologised and confirmed the fines have been paid. The people suspected of leaking CCTV footage of the former Health Secretary and his aide kissing in his office will not be prosecuted. The video, which led to Matt Hancock's resignation, showed him embracing Gina Colandango while social distancing rules were in place. The Information Commissioner's office has concluded that the evidence is insufficient to charge anyone. International news now, and the UK is sanctioning 178 Russian separatists for propping up breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine. The move's been coordinated with the European Union. It's as Moscow's bombardment of the country continues. In his latest address, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Russia's using phosphorus bombs against his country. You're up to date now on GB News. We're on your TV, online and DAB+ radio. Don't go anywhere. Darren will be back shortly.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Very welcome back to GB News. It is 22 minutes, pretty much, bang on to 4 o'clock. Thank you for your company. We're on TV, online and on your DAB digital radios. Let's now turn to the situation in Ukraine, because Russia has been accused of using chemical weapons on Ukrainians in the besieged city of Mariupol in a potential horrific escalation of the war. The Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, has said that the UK and other allies were working urgently to verify the details of the alleged chemical attack. Of course, the issues of chemical attacks have been described as a red line for the West and could see more offensive tactics from NATO. The city of Mariupol has been under siege by Russia for weeks and has faced some of the most devastating damage of the conflict so far, which has resulted in a humanitarian crisis within the city. In the last few hours, President Zelensky has accused Russian forces of using phosphorus bombs. Well, joining me now from Salisbury is the former British Army officer and chemical weapons expert Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, who is there for us. Thank you, as always, for joining us. We know that this is being investigated, isn't it, by different countries and different intelligence services, but it really would be a marked change, an horrific turn, if you like, in this conflict if it was proven that Russia had indeed deployed chemical weapons.
Well, it would. Unfortunately, it's going to be very difficult to prove that that's the case, and it's going to be a huge challenge to get samples from those people who have been injured and also environmental samples from the ground to independent laboratories where it could be analysed. And it will take some time. It's not going to, it's not going to happen in the next few hours or couple of days. It's something that I did with others in Syria. It took time, but it's crucially important. We know that on Monday, overnight on Monday, there was some sort of attack in Mariupol, whether it was a white phosphorus attack, which these incendiary bombs that the Prime President of Ukraine has just been talking about. It could well also, there's a big steel factory in Mariupol where many toxic chemicals like chlorine and ammonia are stored. If that was directly targeted, that could produce some sort of toxic cloud. Or, as people actually in Mariupol defending it are saying, it's some sort of chemical agent. The key thing is, I think, that it is part of the sort of Russian playbook. We know in Syria, when the Syrian regime got bogged down in cities Aleppo is very similar to Mariupol. They then went to chemicals because they are morbidly brilliant weapons in fighting in towns and cities if you have no morals or scruples. And I think whatever comes to the conclusion here, NATO just must step up its effort to support the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian military with intelligence and with weapons, but not to get decisively engaged with the Russians themselves, because that would escalate things to a much wider conflict.
Just focusing, if we can, on Mariupol for a second, it looks like that city's about to fall, or certainly that's what I've heard analysts say today, that it could be within hours, certainly within days. Is that what you're hearing? Is that what your sense of what you're seeing?
Well, yeah, Darren, it certainly looks like that. This place has taken an absolute hammering. I think the Russian Ministry of Defense have just released some drone footage showing that the place is razed to the ground. There's still 100,000 people in there. What sort of state they're in, God knows. We hear there may be tens of thousands of civilians dead amongst that rubble, and a couple of hundred Ukrainian military fighters, holding out. One would expect that they cannot hold out much longer. We understand they haven't got much ammunition, much food. So they've done an incredible job. But I think, the other experts who've looked at this and your own opinion, sadly, I think Mariupol is about to go. And that will be a key thing, because then Russia have got control of the south. We then go into the devastating next part of this conflict, the battle for Donbass, where hundreds of Russian tanks are lined up. I feel that the Russians are going to come unstuck in the Donbass as well. They were defeated in the north. And if they get held, which I think is highly likely, what happens next is an absolute nightmare, because Putin will either sue for peace, which hopefully he will, or he'll escalate. And I think the next few weeks are going to be absolutely devastating. And, we'll test the resolve. Absolutely key that our resolve is as firm as it can be, and NATO, led by Britain, leads the support to Ukraine to hold the Russians so we can bring them to the negotiation table.
Is there a feeling, though, that in the end, the only way that that could happen if Russia, now focused on the Donbass region, it is literally to bomb people into submission, that they will just keep shelling?
Well, that's what we saw in Syria, but we've also seen, throughout history, in these sort of fights, and the Russians know it too well about Stalingrad in the Second World War. You can bomb and bomb and bomb, but actually a determined defensive force and determined civilians, the Ukrainian civilians have shown so much resolve that actually, as we saw in Syria, the only way to win these battles in the end is to use unconventional weapons like chemical weapons, or dare I say, even nuclear weapons. So I think that is the issue. That's why I think NATO's done a great job, and I know that the Ukrainian government are overwhelmingly thankful for the efforts that the British people and the British government have done to support them. But we must do all we can to get the Russians to the negotiation table, because it will either see massive casualties on an even bigger scale than we've seen so far, and more war crimes. 700 people allegedly murdered in Bucha, and the International Criminal Court investigates there at the moment. Let's hope we can bring the Russians to the negotiation table before we get to some sort of Armageddon, and find some sort of peace that will allow the Ukrainian people to rebuild their devastated country.
I saw pictures of some French investigators, French military investigators in Bucha earlier on today. Just finally, Hamish, before we let you go, you talked about Russian casualties there, and we know that actually Vladimir Putin's spokesperson has recognised that there have been significant Russian casualties, even if they haven't released official figures for a very long period of time. Is there a point at which you think either actually lots of these kind of battalions become operationally just unable to operate, and thus they'll have to fall back? Or do you think at some stage some of the military commanders will turn to Putin and say, this has to end because we are losing so many troops, it's not sustainable? Is that possible?
Well, one would expect so. Unfortunately, the chain of command in the Russian military is not how we recognise it, and that's one of the reasons we think they're performing so badly. We're even hearing today, actually, from Bucha that there are 1,500 Russian soldiers in morgues in Bucha that haven't been claimed. I think what is key is that Russian people understand what is going on, the war crimes in their name, and their sons and daughters who have been slaughtered, who are dying on the battlefields of Ukraine. It would appear they just don't know that. And with all these Russian dead still in Ukraine, hopefully the Russian people will understand what's going on, and it will be them who brings this war to an end and removes the current leadership.
Really, really appreciate that. Top analysis as ever. Hamish, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on GB News. That's Hamish de Bretton-Gordon joining us from Salisbury. Let's stay, though, with the issue of Ukraine, because leaders have delivered a blunt message to the German president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier. They said, essentially, you're not welcome here. Steinmeier, seen as a symbol of Germany's soft power, but also soft line on Moscow. He was with the Irish president before the invasion of Ukraine, said on Tuesday he had intended to meet President Zelensky in Kyiv, along with the presidents of Poland and the 3 Baltic states. But the Ukrainians said the move amounted to humiliation for the German head of state, who previously served as its foreign minister. Well, join me now from Berlin for some reaction is a good friend of the programme, Thomas Barrow, who is there. Thomas, good afternoon again to you. The German president, pretty popular at home. It's not like an executive position that we see in France or the United States. It's a symbolic position. Quite extraordinary for the Ukrainians to essentially say, you're not welcome.
It is extraordinary, and we're not talking here about any politician. You're right that Mr. Steinmeier is not in government, but he is indeed the head of state. He is a politician that represents Germany as a country, as a whole. And as such, that idea that he is not welcome in Ukraine by Ukrainian authorities has been received here not only with criticism, but also with concern, also by analysts who are saying that this only makes things more difficult when it comes to Germany's solidarity towards Ukraine, Germany's policy towards Ukraine. And at the same time, it makes even less likely that the Chancellor, so the head of government, Olaf Scholz, would actually go to Ukraine. He has been invited to Ukraine, Mr. Scholz, but it is now obviously unlikely that this will happen in the next few days or even very soon, simply because here in Germany, the Chancellor would not want to be seen as heading to Ukraine when the President, the head of state, was actually uninvited.
Yeah, we're looking at Olaf Scholz in the Bundestag at the moment from pictures filmed earlier on. Of course, he was one of the last leaders, wasn't he, to visit Vladimir Putin before the invasion. But we heard about new sanctions today, a joint move, Thomas, from the UK and the European Union.
Yes, and sanctions is obviously the way forward, at least as far as Germany and the EU are also concerned. They have stressed on various occasions that they want to move in that direction, that they consider, and that's something, by the way, that Olaf Scholz has stressed himself, that those sanctions are being effective to put more and more pressure on Russia. But there are obviously growing questions as to those sanctions that have been imposed so far, those different rounds of sanctions, are actually enough, or whether the EU in particular should move even further, for example, when it comes to Russia's energy sector. And there again, Germany's stance is very much criticized, including by Ukrainian officials who believe that Germany has too soft a stance and that its dependence on Russian energy is too high and can therefore not be in a position to support stronger sanctions, as other European countries have indeed done. So all this is part of this criticism from Ukraine to German positions in particular, not only the current government, but also governments in the past, including Angela Merkel, the former chancellor, and including obviously Mr. Steinmeier, who is now the president, but in the past, as you mentioned in your introduction, was Germany's foreign minister. So all in all, you can clearly say that Germany is facing some sort of a reckoning when it comes to its policy towards Russia in the last few days, in the last few decades, and that a lot is being discussed here, a lot is being changed, but there's also, as we've already seen, a lot of criticism coming not only from Ukraine, also from other European partners when it comes to Germany's position towards Moscow and towards Ukraine.
Yeah, fascinating. I was listening to a Ukrainian MP this morning who was making the point that the war is costing Vladimir Putin around $1 billion a day, but yet it is $1 billion a day, roughly, that's been sent by European countries to Russia every day for oil and gas. But in the end, there has to be real politics here. It's something I was talking to the Hungarians about yesterday, is that for many countries, it is simply impossible to simply turn off the oil and gas from Russia. It would mean entire sectors of the economy having to shut down.
And Hungary is one example, Germany is another example, Austria is another example. Dependence in that particular case in those countries is relatively high, and as such, politicians from all those countries have stressed that yes, it would be ideal to put more pressure on Russia, but not if that means that the countries themselves, so Hungary, Austria, Germany and others, would then suffer massive political and, above all, economic consequences. German politicians here, in particular the Vice-Chancellor Robert Habeck, have stressed that Germany could face mass unemployment, poverty, even higher inflation, that there could be a recession in the country, and that as such, Germany and other European countries have to weigh very carefully what exactly they do, what sanctions they then approve, and what that would mean not only for Russia, but also for the local economies. And that's essentially the reason why Germany has so far not approved, not supported the idea of an oil or a gas embargo towards Moscow.
Thomas, as always, thank you very much indeed. Thomas Barrow there joining us from Berlin. OK, we're going to end the programme on potential travel chaos this weekend, whether you're getting on a train, on a plane, even if you're getting on the roads. It's going to be pretty difficult by all estimations. Let's talk to Simon Calder, a man who knows it all. He is in Milan for us. Lucky you, Simon. But it is looking pretty tricky, isn't it? There's lots of railway lines closed and airlines are still cancelling flights.
Yeah, shall we start on the railways? It's going to be pretty tough if you want to catch the West Coast Main Line. That connects, of course, London Euston with the West Midlands, with North West England and with southern Scotland. Now, because of work to do with HS2 and some other things, the Euston end is going to be completely closed from Good Friday through to Easter Monday. There's also going to be work elsewhere on the line, for instance, on Saturday and Sunday between Coventry and Birmingham. Then further up the line, particularly in the southern part of Scotland. So on the East Coast main line, it's looking pretty grim, and that's also going to affect football fans coming from Manchester and Liverpool for the FA Cup semi-final that is happening in Wembley. Many closures elsewhere, in particular, 3 of our top airports, London Heathrow, London Stansted, London Gatwick, are going to see links closed. The Piccadilly line tube trains, which normally run out to Heathrow, those won't be working all the way through the Easter holiday. Neither will the Stansted Express or the Gatwick Express. But to get to Gatwick, you have got other trains going from London Bridge, from Blackfriars, from St Pancras on the Thameslink line.
Indeed, and I'm making that very journey myself to Gatwick and going, as you say, via London Bridge. But let's talk about flights, because we know lots of airports have been affected by cancellations and airlines cancelling flights. Manchester, Gatwick, Heathrow seem particularly impacted. And their argument is that actually they're blaming the government for not supplying security passes quickly. But there's a whole load of reasons why airports and airlines have been affected.
Yes, and bluntly, it comes down to the fact that the demand for travel has soared even faster than some people were expecting. Because if you go back 4 months, the UK had by far the most draconian, expensive, complicated travel rules of any country in Europe. And now we've got none at all, and everybody wants to travel away. As a result, at about the time when the airports and the airlines could have been recruiting more staff, what they were actually doing was thinking, hang on, we've lost billions of pounds so far in the pandemic. Do we really want to invest some more? There's also problems with check-in staff, with ground handling, with baggage handling, and security passes are one part of it. But the airlines and the airports are keen to sort of play down that aspect. And they're doing, of course, all they can, basically throwing money at the problem and trying to get more people to work a bit of overtime to get us through fairly swiftly. And looking at the state of play today, actually, Wednesday, midweek, quiet travel day, people are getting through really quickly. Whether that's still the case tomorrow night and on Friday, who knows?
Oh, don't tell me that, Simon. Least we want to hear. As always, thank you very much indeed, Simon Coulter there.
Thank you.
In sunny Milan. Thank you. That is it from me for today. We are back, of course, tomorrow. Tom is on at 9:30. I'll be back at 12 and at 3 for all the latest political news, debate and analysis here on GB News. You will not want to miss that. Up next, though, it is Colin Brazier between 4 and 6 p.m. preparing the way across the studio there. He is on just after the break. But before all of that, let's bring you up to date with the weather. And if you're not going away, it's pretty good this weekend. I'll see you tomorrow.
Hello, I'm Alex Deakin with your latest weather update. Some heavy showers around today. They'll be fading through the evening and overnight, and for most, it's looking like a dry and a bright day to come tomorrow. Low pressure near to the northeast of Scotland, bringing some pretty wet and cold weather across the far northeast, but elsewhere it's been by and large fine. But we have seen some big showers developing across central and southern parts of England and southern parts of Wales. Those heavy downpours still continuing for the next few hours before steadily fading away through this evening, and most places dry from midnight onwards. The wet weather in the far northeast